I'm joined today by Bonnie S. Glaser from the Asia program of the German Marshall Fund. She also hosts the fund's China Global podcast, exploring different facets of China's foreign policy and what they mean for the rest of the world. Ms. Glaser was previously Senior Advisor for Asia and the Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's also a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, and a Senior Associate with the Pacific Forum, with more than 3 decades of experience working at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and US policy. Ms. Glaser, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.
So what we're talking about today is the recent sale of arms from the US to Taiwan. The US State Department has approved the sale of 40 howitzers and various other weapons on last Wednesday, to a value of around $750 million US. That still has to pass through various congressional hurdles before it can go ahead, but Taiwan analysts think it should go ahead in the next month or so. I mean, what's the significance of this move, and what does it tell us, I mean, if anything, about Biden's plans for dealing with Taiwan?
Well, first it tells us that the Biden administration is complying with U.S. law, because under the Taiwan Relations Act from 1979, the president is actually obligated to sell defensive weapons to Taiwan. So the Biden administration, like all of his predecessors, will continue to sell arms to Taiwan. Secondly, I think it is evidence that the Biden administration is going to sell weapons to Taiwan as requests come in from Taipei. That is, one at a time, not necessarily bundling them into larger packages, which was what was done in the Obama administration the last time that the Democrats were in power. The Trump administration changed that practice, and the Biden administration, it looks like, will continue the practice of the Trump administration. So as Taiwan requests a weapon system, it will be evaluated by itself, not necessarily held back and potentially made public only when it's convenient or will have the least damage on the U.S.-China relationship, which was sometimes part of the U.S. approach to selling weapons.
I mean, you co-authored a report with the Center for Strategic and International Studies last year, calling for the US to make substantive actions that meaningfully enhance Taiwan's security, stability, and prosperity. I mean, how does this sale fit into that? And has there been too much of a focus in the past on military goods over economic cooperation?
Well, I think that this sale was actually in the works for a couple of years, so its origins really do go back to the Trump administration. But I think that this continues a practice of helping Taiwan to acquire the capability to defend itself, to hold out against an attack from the PLA, and to develop more asymmetric capabilities. The latter half of your question, really, it's not mutually exclusive. The United States really does have many ways of strengthening Taiwan's security, and we need to do so by selling weapons, by working with Taiwan's military, but also having a very robust economic relationship. And we have a very strong trade relationship with Taiwan. And we have been, I think, expanding that economic relationship by talking with Taiwan, for example, about making supply chains more resilient. And we have been talking about other elements of the economic relationship. But what's missing is there's been an absence of trade agreements negotiated between the United States and Taiwan. And there's been a call by the U.S. Congress and I think widespread support in the Republican and Democratic parties for negotiating a free trade agreement with Taiwan. There has also been some talk about maybe negotiating an agreement that would end the double taxation that exists when one side invests in the other's country. So there just is no trade negotiation really underway. We have had recently a round of what we call the TIFA, the Trade Investment Framework Agreement, which hadn't been held since the Obama administration. So we'll have to see if that is followed up by anything substantial. But my own sense from just being in Washington, D.C. and talking to people who are closely engaged on these issues is that the prospects for negotiating trade agreements in the near term are not very good, in part because the Biden administration is not really prioritizing negotiating trade agreements with other countries. So this is not just a policy focused on Taiwan, it's really just an emphasis on the policy and foreign policy for the middle class of the United States and less enthusiasm than some prior administrations for joining multilateral trade arrangements.
I know that some scholars, notably Oriana Skylar Mastro, who's a former guest on this show, say that Beijing is closer to an attack on Taiwan than most analysts might expect, and that the US is not doing enough to deter Beijing militarily. I mean, while other people see this as invasion panic. I mean, what's your view on this situation?
Well, I think the majority of defense experts believe that the PLA is not yet confident that it can seize and hold Taiwan. After all, there's about 100 miles of water that the PLA would have to cross. Taiwan's geography is very inhospitable. This would not be a cakewalk, as they say. But yes, there's growing concern overall about the expanding capabilities of the PLA and the potential for Taiwan eventually having the capabilities. But the question, of course, is that the intention of China matters as well, not just the capabilities of the PLA. And my own view is that Xi Jinping's risk-benefit calculus really does fall on the side of very heavy risks, costs that China would pay if it invaded Taiwan today. I also think that China's priorities are such that it requires the deterrence of Taiwan going independent, declaring and being supported by other nations as an independent sovereign state and becoming de jure a legal independent country. That is Xi Jinping's most important priority when it comes to Taiwan, and it has been the priority of his predecessors. Reunification is a longer term goal. It is not something that Xi Jinping needs to achieve today. The risks are many. They involve potential failure, which could affect the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. They involve the risk, of course, of a wider war with the United States, because China knows that the United States is quite likely to come to Taiwan's defense. Then there's the reaction of other countries. I think other countries would fear that China might become emboldened. If it used force against Taiwan, it might use force to solve other territorial disputes, and therefore other countries might decide that they need to cooperate more closely with the United States, other countries, in forming an anti-China coalition to stop China from becoming a more aggressive power, something that many countries today are really not doing. They're trying to avoid choosing between the United States and China in many cases. So I think there's actually a long list of risks that Xi Jinping faces. I think he doesn't need, for domestic reasons, to reunify with Taiwan anytime in the near future. So I think this is a question we need to pay attention to. It's not invasion panic. There could come a time when China decides that the time is right for invading Taiwan. So we do need to be prepared. We need to be prepared militarily, the United States, but also Taiwan, to deter that attack, make Xi Jinping and the PLA think twice, but also to fight if one day China does in fact use force.
I mean, on the topic of unification and the relationship between China and Taiwan, I know that some people have argued that the kind of move by the Trump administration, particularly in the latter half or the very end of the Trump administration, to allow high-level contact between the US and Taiwan officials has in fact weakened the United States one China policy to the detriment of the US and Taiwan interests. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, first, I think that the Trump administration really didn't set a new bar for contacts with Taiwan. After all, cabinet level officials had been sent to Taiwan by prior administrations. So even the Obama administration had sent a member of the cabinet to Taiwan. There were probably more frequent high level contacts with Taiwan, and the Trump administration also made public many things that it was doing that had been done before, but quietly. So monthly sails through the Taiwan Strait by the U.S. Navy, for example, have been taking place for quite some time, but they were made public by the Trump administration. That continues under the Biden administration. But I think it's important to understand what the U.S. One China policy is and is not. And it is essentially acknowledging and recognizing that China, the PRC, holds the position of representing China in the international community. So at the UN, there's one sovereign state called China. The United States, for a very long time, has not taken a position on the sovereignty over Taiwan. It believes that that's unsettled, so it doesn't recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign state. That said, the U.S. continues to strongly support Taiwan and has a very, very strong unofficial relationship with Taiwan. And by Washington's definition, that unofficial relationship includes sending high-level officials to Taiwan when it serves U.S. interests to do so. And that's particularly in areas like global health, because we share a lot in common with Taiwan. Also, of course, other areas where we might work together with Taiwan. So in the future, if we had a trade agreement with Taiwan, you might see a commerce secretary or even an agriculture secretary visit Taiwan. So I think that the United States, under the Trump and Biden administrations, continues to push the limits of what it is willing to do under the One China policy, and that is a fact. But nonetheless, it still maintains the core of its One China policy, that is recognizing that the PRC is the sole representative of China in the international community.
Now, stepping back now for a second from Taiwan alone, how do you see Taiwan fitting into US policy for the broader Indo-Pacific region in the coming years?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because under the Trump administration, Taiwan was very explicitly identified as part of the United States Indo-Pacific strategy. We did see a report come out of the Pentagon that actually referred to Taiwan as a country, put it in the same basket with a few other countries like New Zealand and Singapore that are considered to be very important partners of the United States. That was unprecedented. We will see in the coming weeks the Biden administration issue its Indo-Pacific strategy. And one of the things I think that will be interesting to look for is how Taiwan is addressed in that strategy. But there's no doubt that a consistent component of U.S. interests and strategy in the Indo-Pacific is preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. That, I think, is indisputable. That will remain central. But the question is whether the United States will continue to support a more active role for Taiwan as a player in the Indo-Pacific, which we certainly saw under the Trump administration. My guess is that the Biden administration will continue to support Taiwan as a very important actor in the Indo-Pacific region, but it might do so in a somewhat less public way than the Trump administration did.
Ms. Glaser, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.